What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The Pansexual Adventures of Lord Byron, the Harry Styles of the 19th century. Nobody from the 19th century partied harder than one of the best poets of the Romantic era, Lord George Gordon Byron. But exactly who was George Gordon Byron? His fame was so immense that women and men all over Europe threw themselves at him. He was the reigning king of brief, torrid affairs and one-night stands. Byron was, without a doubt, a product of his times and upbringing, albeit on the extreme end of prevailing standards. For example, his father was a complete and dissolute cad, abandoning his son and wife very early on. His mother had a vile temper, and he was seduced and sexually abused by a nursemaid when he was a child. This doesn't excuse any of Byron's later behavior, but his early life experiences certainly contributed to his formation and understanding of relationships. After all, he'd been provided only examples of reckless romantic and sexual behavior. Lord Byron left a long trail of broken hearts and venereal diseases. Did he have syphilis in his wake? His personal life was as closely followed as his poetry, and George Gordon Byron's scandals were notorious and innumerable. There are many bizarre facts about Lord Byron, as he lived his life to the utmost and never held back. Read on for lots of sexy Lord Byron trivia. Byron was the 19th century Elvis. Byron's star first sparkled publicly during his maiden speech at the House of Lords in 1812. No one more handsome or aristocratic had ever spoken out so eloquently and vociferously on behalf of the common people than the 24-year-old writer and nobleman. In a matter of months, his name and visage were all over European newspapers and in the finest literary and intellectual salons. He was audacious, irreverent, and dreamy to behold. Men and women alike threw themselves at Byron. His poetry was memorized and quoted and recited. His blatant, unashamed sexuality was both scorned and admired. In other words, he was an instant superstar. In matters of love, Byron's policy was total inclusiveness. Byron possessed an enormous capacity for life, and an even larger capacity for the pleasures of the flesh. Everything he did was done in a big way. He had the money and status to live as large as he wanted, and he never cut corners. Pursued by both women and men, Byron took joy and pleasure with all, leaving a trail of broken and sometimes bitter hearts along the way. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So, Lord Byron was notorious in his lifestyle and for his love 'em and leave 'em approach. And yes, it was Lady Caroline Lamb who spread the phrase that Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Well, she was right about that, but the lady protested too much. In fact, Lamb was far more salacious in her conduct and behavior than Byron was at the time. Talk about pot and kettle. She was among the many people who threw herself at him, demanding he sleep with her. Byron complied, but was actually so appalled by Lamb's extreme sexual behavior and her general craziness, that he instantly cut off his relationship with her. Byron's long affair with his sister produced a child. Lord Byron was a genius, but he was also a hot mess. His hot mess aspect played a major role in ruining his life. His obsession with all things sensual was profound. If he wanted someone, he had them. His popularity and good looks guaranteed the fulfillment of his every sexual fantasy. In the 19th century, a nobleman who relished the life of a libertine was frowned upon, but it was not illegal. However, when it became known that he'd maintained an affair with his half-sister, Augusta Lee, for a number of years, and that the affair had produced a daughter, Medora, Byron was severely and socially pressured to remove himself from the country and live in exile. Despite Byron's wild personal life, there was a Lady Byron. Pressured by family and society to settle down, Byron decided to take a wife. His choice shocked many, since Lady and Isabella Milbanke was his polar opposite. Perhaps he chose her as a way to prop up his own sordid reputation, or maybe even have some of her purported goodness rub off on him. Lady Anne was a rare persona for her times. She was highly educated, very religious, and strict in her morality. Obviously, it was not a lasting marriage. Gossip and evidence detailing her new husband's sexual escapades reached the ears of Byron's bride. Lady Byron was with her husband just long enough to produce his only legitimate heir, daughter Ada. Lady Byron later wrote her memoirs, detailing every salacious bit she'd learned about her husband's secret life, including the affair with his own sister. The memoir wasn't published till after both their deaths, but in life, Lady Byron did much to spread stories about her husband, which resulted in his self-imposed exile from Britain. He may have had many male lovers throughout his life. For many years, literary experts and biographers have debated Byron's interest in men as sexual partners. A big part of the problem for historians and literary types is that any man of 19th century Britain who also happened to be bisexual or gay could never let that be known. It was a particular problem for noblemen, who were supposed to serve as the moral compass for the rest of society. So, if Byron did not publicly announce his sexuality, he had compelling reasons for remaining silent. Thus, there is no overt evidence for his homosexuality or bisexuality. Due to the ultimate discretion required, Byron may have had brief, even anonymous sexual encounters with men. There is lots of circumstantial evidence that points to Byron's male lovers. When Byron was but a lad of 16, he met a farm boy named William Fletcher. Legend has it that Byron first saw him plowing a field, was instantly attracted, and made the young man his valet, which was a remarkable jump up in status for a farm boy. Fletcher remained with Byron until his master's death. There was at least one other servant of Byron's who may have been his lover. His name was Giovanni Battista Falsieri, who was called Tita. Byron brought him into his service when he was living in Venice. Falsieri was a handsome young gondolier, a profession that has a tradition of offering paid sexual services in addition to boating duties. Within Byron's body of literary work are found a number of poems written to and about a number of young noblemen. There is even a collection of these poems available. Additionally, Byron was known to have handsome, young male travel companions, including Dr. John Polidori, who was his constant companion the last 4 years of his life, Count Pietro Gamba, authors Edward Trelawney, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Edward Williams. Byron's behavior was so scandalous he was forced into a self-imposed exile. By the middle of 1815, Byron's name and reputation had become so sullied that he made plans to leave Britain entirely. While quite a few among the nobility were aware of his sexual excesses, much of the gossip remained within noble families. It was Lady Byron who blasted his activities beyond the closed circles of British nobility. When she left with their 1-month-old daughter to visit her parents in January 1816, she filed separation papers and never returned. Marital separation and divorce in the 19th century was a scandalous thing, and an actual divorce required an Act of Parliament. It would be a media heyday, and many of Byron's secrets would be publicly exposed. The poet saw the writing on the wall and fled his homeland voluntarily, never to return. Claire Clairmont sunk her talons into Byron. Claire Clairmont was the daughter of the second wife of William Godwin, who was a well-known English literary critic. Claire grew up in a household full of literary theory, surrounded by all the fashionable and popular poets and writers of the age, including her stepsister, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Frankenstein. When Percy Bysshe Shelley wanted to elope with Mary, Claire went with them to Europe. It was a huge scandal at the time. While in Europe, the Shelleys met up with Byron, who was still rather depressed about the circumstances surrounding his recent exile from Britain and the numerous personal scandals he left in his wake. Claire, like many others, was instantly attracted to Byron, and essentially badgered him into having an affair with her. For Byron, affairs were just that, and not intended to last very long or mean very much. Claire regarded the relationship very differently and became a thorn in Byron's side. Over the years, he came to loathe her. Much later, Claire wrote a scathing memoir of her experiences with Byron, Shelley, and others, and labeled them monsters. Byron and the Shelleys lived like hippies in Europe. Anyone who thinks the hippies of the 1960s were original in their ideas of communal living and free love needs to examine the lives of the early 19th century British Romantic writers and poets. Particularly of note are the circumstances under which Byron, the Shelleys, Claire Claremont, and others were living in 1816. Most of these young people had fled their homeland because the lives they wished to lead were simply socially unacceptable there. They often lived together in communal settings, wrote together, particularly during the infamous Year Without a Summer, 1816, and practiced free love with one another and with others they encountered on their travels. They traversed from France to Switzerland to Italy and eventually Greece. Byron journeyed to Venice and lived like Dionysus. By the end of 1816, Byron and company had made their way to Venice, and it was there that he was at his most outrageous. He conducted numerous affairs, allowed all manner of people to live in his rented abode, the Mocenigo Palace, which was located on the Grand Canal. Some of these included known sex workers, both male and female, and others of disreputable station. Life was an ongoing party at this point, though clearly Byron's spirit remained troubled and restless. During his stay in Venice, he also shared his home with 14 servants, including Fletcher and Tita, 2 monkeys, 2 mastiff dogs and a fox. It was in Venice that he began writing his great romantic poem, Don Juan. Perhaps he took some inspiration from the newest love in his life, the teenage Teresa Gamba Giccioli. She would turn out to be his last love. The tragedy of Byron's daughter, Allegra. During their on-again, off-again affair, Claire Claremont became pregnant with Byron's child. Their daughter, Allegra, was born in Bath, England, in January of 1817. Byron was living it up in Venice at the time and expressed zero interest in his offspring. In fact, he derided her, along with her mother. The baby remained with her mother for 1 year, until, inexplicably, Byron demanded she be sent to join him in Venice. Though Claire was heartbroken, she decided that her child would benefit from the type of luxurious upbringing Byron could provide, and so the child was sent to join her father. Within a year or so, Allegra was a toddler living at Byron's Venetian palace. Byron had become even more reckless, bringing in a long series of one-night stands that ranged from contessas to milkmaids. His friend and poet Percy Shelley approached Byron, suggesting that maybe the torrid atmosphere of the palace was not the right place for a little girl, but Byron dismissed Shelley's genuine concerns. Claire began writing to him, begging to see her daughter. Byron eventually sent little Allegra to live at a convent. He only occasionally visited her there, and so the child was cut off from both parents and living among strangers. Shelley took pity on the child and visited her at the convent, bringing her a pretty gold chain to wear. Allegra begged the poet to take her to see her parents. Back in England, Claire became so desperate she began to devise a kidnapping plot to rescue her daughter. It was all for naught, because later that year Allegra took ill and died. Byron's sole legitimate heir was an early computer genius. If you've heard of Ada Lovelace, you probably know her as one of the first computer programmers. She was also Lord Byron's daughter and his only legitimate heir. It's rather hard to imagine that 2 more different people would have such a close association, though Ada never knew her father and he passed when she was only 8. And he was never a doting father either. In fact, his first words to her upon her birth were, "Oh, what an implement of torture have I acquired in you." He and Lady Byron separated only a month after their daughter was born. Lady Byron was determined that her daughter would not follow in her father's libertine footsteps, and encouraged Ada to engage in mathematics and sciences. Ada spent little time on poetry and other romantic pursuits. When Ada was 12, she developed plans for a flying machine. Later, grandfather of all things computer, Charles Babbage, became her mentor. Despite her career in math and science, Ada loved literature and sought to know her father through his work. When she passed, she was buried beside him. Despite his glamour, Byron had a club foot and struggled with his weight. Photo. British Library Flickr. No known copyright restrictions. Despite his glamour, Byron had a club foot and struggled with his weight. Despite his glamorous, rakish reputation which he relished, Byron hid from the public the fact that he was born with a club foot. He also struggled with a weight problem for most of his life. As an early 19th century celebrity, he didn't have to worry too much about exposure of either, since photography had yet to pervade the media. Byron officiated at Shelley's beachside funeral and wanted Shelley's skull as a souvenir. Most of the male British romantics lived hard and died young. When Byron's friend, Percy Shelley, drowned on a capsized boat off an Italian coast, his body washed ashore and was immediately buried on the beach. However, Italian law dictated that the bodies would need to be exhumed and cremated. According to poet Edward Trelawney, who was also present for Shelley's cremation, the body was exhumed and placed on a pyre to burn. Salt, wine, and frankincense were poured on and around Shelley's remains. Trelawney claims that Shelley's heart was removed and measured prior to the cremation. A large and curious crowd had gathered at that point. Byron became very emotional over the passing of his friend and the terribly romantic setting of the cremation. He even asked to keep Shelley's skull. Once the flames were lit and smoke rose from the pyre, Byron stripped off his clothes and walked into the ocean, where he remained, floating and swimming, for most of the ceremony. Lord Byron had a strong interest in the macabre. Byron's request for taking Shelley's cremated skull probably didn't surprise those who knew him well. The celebrity poet had a strong interest in all things macabre and gothic, as seen in his works. He was denied Shelley's skull because he was notorious for using human skulls as drinking goblets, and Shelley's wife, Mary, and other friends did not wish such a future for their loved one's remains. Evidence of Byron's interest in dark themes was seen in the coffin displayed in the dining room, the skulls from his ancestral crypt that were used as flower pots, and the parties with paranormal-related events. He even had his guests wear long, hooded robes to these spooky gatherings. Byron enjoyed making love to his last mistress aboard a Venetian gondola. Byron's conduct while living in Venice, Italy, can best be described as akin to a tomcat. He boasted of his sexual conquests, numbering in the hundreds. And yet, he still managed to conduct one last heartfelt affair. Her name was Teresa Giucoli, a beautiful young woman who was married to a much older man. Byron doted on her, describing her visage as fair as the sunrise and warm as the moon. The pair had a fondness of making love aboard a gondola as it traversed the canals of the city. It was during this time that Byron returned again to pen and paper, writing what some consider his greatest work, the poem Don Juan. Most people today pronounce the title as it is properly spoken in Spanish or Italian. However, Byron was an Englishman who purposefully intended his work to be pronounced, no matter how incorrect it is, as Don Juan, with an emphasis on the Jew. He was dissatisfied with life until he found Greece. Part of the reason Byron's life in Venice seemed so scattered and pointless had to do with the poet's dissatisfaction with life in general. He knew he had already lived a very full, exciting life, but in his view, he'd never taken on a great cause. Towards the end of his stay in Italy, he hit upon what would at last serve as his great and noble cause. He'd heard about how the Greeks were fighting against their then overlords, the Turks, in an effort to gain independence. Byron had always self-identified with the Greeks and their culture. Here was the ultimate opportunity to glory in that culture and fight for a great cause. And so he left Italy for Greece, where he would be until the end of his days. Lord Byron was an old-school Luddite. An exploration of Byron's life is like a tour through every tenet of the Romantic movement. Though he is often thought of as an iconoclast and a reformer, he actually embraced the Luddite movement. Today, the term Luddite is used to refer to a person who refuses to keep up with the times, particularly with regard to technology. For example, a person who prefers to use a VCR for watching movies could rightfully be called a Luddite. However, in the early 19th century, the actual Luddite movement was underway, and their complaint was essentially against the Industrial Revolution, with its factories, machines doing the work formerly done by humans, and the many other aspects of modern industry that changed society forever. Byron was one of the few among the nobility who openly supported the Luddites. In doing so, he was living up to the Romantic idea that the only answer for humankind is to return to nature and avoid the modern world. A romantic life led to an early, romantic death. In 1823, Byron eagerly set sail for Greece. His heart was filled with the excitement of having finally found a great and noble cause worthy of his support. When he heard about the Greek fight for independence from the Turks, his natural affinity for all things Greek demanded he join the cause. In typical romantic fashion, he probably had visions of grandeur, imagining his leading the charge in a heated battle. Alas, Byron was disappointed upon his arrival to Greece. The only position he managed to secure was the job of obtaining supplies for those doing the actual fighting. He spent his spare time roaming about the Greek mainland and islands, perhaps most memorably leaving his famous graffito on the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Saunion, which can still be viewed today. By the spring of 1824, Byron's health began to fail. In April, he developed a high fever and collapsed into bed. Doctors were summoned, who bled him and attached leeches, but it was to no avail. 10 days later, the great libertine and poet died. He was only 36. His body was sent to England, where it was buried near his home. Byron had written extensive memoirs, but would allow them to be published only after his death.